For the keynote tonight, one of the interesting things that we learned or thought about while we were developing this conference, which involves obviously the firm level, but also the macroeconomy, is kind of thinking about, and it was mentioned earlier, I believe in the first session when they were talking about how do you measure the productivity of some of these, and I think Airbnb, for example, was specifically mentioned, and that relates back to a conversation that Lindsay and Atif and I all had about what does it mean to be a firm these days? What are the boundaries of a firm? And things like Airbnb and the sharing economy come to mind. And so with very little research, we dove in, and pretty much the name that came across our radar every single time was Arun Sundararajan. I almost got it right. I practiced for hours. It's actually a wonderful thing. He actually has on his website, if you go out there, he actually has a recording of himself saying his name because he knows it's overly complicated. So let me just tell you a little bit about Arun. So Arun is a professor of business at the New York Stern School of Business, and he's the Robert L. and Dale Atkins faculty fellow there, but you're also an affiliated faculty member of NYU's Center for Data Science and the Center for Urban Science and Progress. He has a best-selling and award-winning book called, simply titled, The Sharing Economy. That shows you he's the emphatic expert on this. It's won numerous awards and has been translated into numerous languages. He's also authored over 50 peer-reviewed papers, written over 35 op-eds, and has given hundreds of talks globally. His scholarship has been recognized by numerous Best Paper Awards, 2 Google Faculty Awards, and an Axiom Best Business Books Award, and a Thinkers 50 Radar Thinker Award. I had to practice that one a few times. He's a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Technology, Values, and Policy, and he has provided expert testimony about the digital economy to the United States Congress, the European Parliament, the United Nations, the Federal Trade Commission, the White House, and a range of other regulatory agencies globally. He's an advisor to the organization, to organizations such as the City of New York, the City of Seoul, Walmart Corporation, WeShare, and the National League of Cities. So he was concerned that he didn't know about, he gave me the plate. I did take an accounting class once. I appreciate that. But interestingly, for the accountants in the audience, he does actually have a very strong connection to our profession, which I learned through talking with him. It turns out that he got his graduate degree in the 1990s from the University of Rochester. And who was his roommate but Sudipta Basu, which I had no idea. So he's intimately familiar with the principle of conservatism, obviously. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Arun Sundararajan to the stage. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for that wonderful introduction. Sudipta did teach me how to cook. He bailed me out of a whole bunch of situations that I will not get into because it's sort of a, it's really a trip down memory lane. But I generally start these talks by taking a picture of you guys. I hope you don't mind. So I'm just going to do that. So you got to smile, wave. Depending on how drunk you are, that's sort of like, All right. I think I have, yeah. So part of the reason why I take a picture of people before I speak to them is because they seem much more positively inclined to me after that. They ask less difficult questions. I've tried this with my students, and it seems to work pretty well, but it's also because I figure that one day I'm going to have grandkids, and they're not going to listen to me. So I'm going to sort of whip out all these pictures and show them these pictures and say, see, people used to come and listen to me speak, and, so you should too. So I've been at NYU for my entire sort of career as a professor. During this time, the focus of my research and writing and teaching and other activities has been how digital technologies change things. Two of the topics that seem to come up a lot in the world of people who are focused on digital change are one of them is the shifting nature of work. The feeling that somehow the relationship between people who receive money from institutions in exchange for providing labor and talent, and the the institutions themselves, that this relationship has been changing over the last 20 years to the point where a growing fraction, close to a majority of the workforce earns all or part of their income from something other than a full-time job. And the other topic that comes up a lot is, the imminent threat of, advanced digital technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, substituting for human labor at a greater pace than they have historically, leading us to sort of the specter of what will happen when computers have all of the jobs and when the AIs are doing all the cognitive tasks that the human beings used to do. And so I'll come back to both of these topics sort of as I sort of journey through my talk, but in focusing on how does digital technology change things, a topic that has captivated my attention for many years and that I first started noticing in 2011 is the extension of digital technologies out of the digital domain and into industries that at least 10 years ago I did not consider to be part of the digital industries, and that I didn't consider susceptible to digital disruption or digital transformation. They've sort of fit neatly for me under this umbrella of what a lot of people call the sharing economy. I called my book The Sharing Economy because I figured that in 10 or 15 years, nobody will remember who actually coined the term. Then they'll go back and they'll say, oh, he wrote the book on the sharing economy. He must have come up with the term, the sharing economy. I've seen this happen with Web 2.0 and e-commerce, so I've learned from sort of these predecessors. But when most people hear the term sharing economy, they typically sort of, how many of you have taken an Uber? Okay, how many of you have taken a Lyft? Okay, how many of you have stayed in an Airbnb? Okay, that's pretty good. The number of hands that have gone up with each passing year has gone up. How many of you have hosted on Airbnb? Okay, I always feel bad asking this question in a fancy hotel. It's sort of I'm asking you, how many of you are disrupting the business model of sort of the entity that is sort of providing us with this wonderful space? But this is, this is the conception of most people, of the sharing economy for most people, right? We think about Airbnb, that is sort of 2 or 3 years ago started to be valued or started to be priced at a level that was comparable to the the public valuations of companies like Marriott, Starwood, or we associate it with Uber in the United States or Lyft in the United States. But there's a company called Didi Xuxing in China that is in fact the largest ride-hailing platform in the world. They give more rides in China than Uber does globally. They're valued or priced higher than Uber is. They have 4 times as many drivers, I think 10 times as many passengers. And there are stunning amounts of venture capital that have been raised by companies in, by Airbnb certainly, but more so by companies in the ride-hailing space. Tens of billions of dollars of venture capital has flowed into what initially seemed to be companies that were trying to create a new model for hailing a taxi. The worldwide taxi industry is $40 billion, so clearly there's something else going on. And at this point, we realize that it, is an attempt to sort of capture not just in the United States the $10 billion a year that we spend on taxis, but an attempt to capture a fraction of the $1 trillion a year we spend on new and used cars. And so this is sort of one example of a platform-based model that is starting to potentially sort of nibble at or maybe even change the business model of a decidedly physical world industry, right? Automobiles. And so, as I sort of studied Uber and Airbnb initially and peer-to-peer car rentals, it seemed like, across different industries, there was a pattern that, like, the changes in the business models, the platform-based business models that I'll sort of give you some examples of in a few minutes, all seem to rhyme in some sense, and they seem to be potentially representing a new way of organizing economic activity that was decidedly different from the model that we're all used to of, like, the United States, Japan, Western Europe, large companies that hire people full-time, pay them a salary in exchange for their labor and talent, then produce goods and services and deliver these goods and services to consumers. This is sort of the standard conception of what people think business is and, like, what an organization is. And it was the dominant model in many of these countries in the second half of the 20th century. But it seems to be making way, at least in part, to a different sort of relationship, not just between the individual and the institution, but a different way of organizing economic activity that I call crowd-based capitalism. So to explain what crowd-based capitalism is, let me give you some examples. The first example is a familiar one. It's the example of YouTube. This is not part of the sharing economy in a sense, but if you think about the way economic activity was organized during the time that, say we were teenagers, or when we would get our video entertainment by watching television. And there were two large sets of entities involved. There were the companies that produced the content, and then there were the companies that distributed the content to us. So the television studios or the movie studios would produce, like, the actual content that we viewed, and then the television networks would then sort of beam this out to us. And if you fast forward to today or a few years ago, teenagers today get their video entertainment, like, a lot of them, my daughter is 14, she gets her video entertainment from YouTube. She watches YouTube the way I used to watch television when I was a teenager. And YouTube is owned by Google, like, large traditional company. And YouTube is aggregating the demand from people who, like, are looking for content. It's providing some search and discovery capabilities. It's allowing you to sort of find what you're looking for. It's perhaps providing some risk management or trust. You know that there's certain kinds of content that you will not find on YouTube, or you hope you won't find on YouTube, that they're sort of like, they're playing the role of the censor to some extent. But then the actual production of content is done by a distributed and heterogeneous crowd. There are famous musicians, there are movie studios, there are television studios all putting content on YouTube, sure. There are specialists who are earning millions of dollars producing YouTube content and earning money off advertising on that. There are tens of thousands of people who earn a decent living producing content on YouTube, not millions of dollars. And there are millions of others who simply post content on YouTube for fun. So there's a video of me on YouTube hang gliding. I tried to share it with my parents. I was very proud in 2011, and I didn't get my privacy settings right, and it's out there, and 43 people have watched it. So that's this is like entertainment for someone, is watching me, like, sort of cling on for dear life to, like, this dude who was, like, helping me hang glide. But this is This is sort of a good example of the model that I call crowd-based capitalism, the platform that aggregates demand, search and discovery, trust and risk management, but the supply comes from a distributed and heterogeneous crowd. I mean, because you see this to some extent in small business lending as well. There's a platform that I studied extensively in 2014 called Funding Circle, based in the UK. At the time, they were a small business lending site. The typical ask for someone who went to Funding Circle for a loan was about £50,000. The typical asker was a small business. They would provide all of the information that you would typically provide to a bank when you were applying for a small business loan. But the actual issuing of the loan was not done by Funding Circle itself. It was done by a distributed and heterogeneous crowd of lenders. Some of them were individuals who were trying to get a higher interest rate on their savings. Some of them were people with a lot of money who wanted to support the local businesses. Some of them were sort of traditional actors in, the financial services space. And what Funding Circle did was it aggregated the demand. It allowed you to sort of find the kinds of loans that you wanted to lend to. And it provided some sort of trust and risk management through the provision of certain indicators that you could use to make your lending decisions. You have a similar model emerging in tech, largely tech, but equity venture capital through platforms like AngelList and CircleUp that aggregate the demand for venture capital, provide search and discovery, provide some sort of trust and risk management, but the actual investments that are being made on AngelList and CircleUp are not from limited partners that the platform has assembled. They are from a distributed and heterogeneous crowd of now venture capitalists. There are people who are gambling their money. There are people like me who think that they know a bit about tech and are investing. There are traditional venture capitalists who are also investing through these platforms. You see this model in car rental, where platforms ranging from Getaround and Turo in the United States to Drivey in France and Germany to Start in China, are offering cars for rent. And so you go to the platform, you say, I want to rent a car, you provide make, model, or small, mid-size, large, gives you a list of cars, gives you the hourly rate or the daily rate. You click on, I want to rent this one, but that's where the similarity with the traditional car rental companies ends, because the platform is not actually renting you the car. It's an individual, typically, on the other end, who is renting out their car when they're not using it. That's 90% of the cars on these platforms. The remaining 10% come from typically small businesses that have assembled a fleet of from 5 to 20 cars and are running it as a small business. There's even a company called City Car Share in San Francisco, has a fleet of 300 cars that it operates through the Getaround platform. You see early examples of this in grocery through the La Ruche-Qui-Revit network in France. You have some early examples of healthcare services through platforms like WeGo Health and UberDoc. We haven't seen any examples in the energy sector as yet, but I believe that as the battery technology gets robust enough to reliably store the solar power that we generate from our solar panels, we will start to see local redistribution networks with batteries in electric cars and distributed around the neighborhood, providing load balancing. And you could actually start to see an alternative to feeding your energy back into the grid or getting all of your power from a centralized source. So this could potentially create a platform-based alternative to something as non-digital as power generation and transmission. I'm seeing it a lot in professional services. There's a platform called UpCounsel that allows you to hire a lawyer. The typical client of UpCounsel is a business. They have many large businesses who go to the platform looking for legal services. UpCounsel manages the relationships with these large clients. The actual lawyers who these clients then hire do not work for UpCounsel. They are typically individuals who are running their own tiny law practice through the platform, or small boutique firms that are trying to expand their business. So UpCounsel aggregates the demand for them. It provides some search and discovery for the people looking for legal services. It provides some trust or risk management in that it provides reputation scores for the lawyers. It makes sure that the lawyers get paid. But the actual provision of the legal services is being done by increasingly micro entrepreneurs, and there are 25,000 lawyers on UpCounsel now. It's they have typically 15 years of experience. 70% of them have worked for a Fortune 500 company. So this is a crowd-based alternative to the law firm. And I've seen examples, Catalent in management consulting. There's a company called Spry that is doing this for public relations. There's Gigster for high-end machine learning programming. So coming back to Airbnb, Airbnb is the quintessential example and the original example of, in some sense, of crowd-based capitalism in a physical world industry, right? Where they're aggregating the demand for short-term accommodation. They're providing search and discovery. They're providing trust, risk management, certainly. You can assess that host using the reputation. Airbnb has a team of 600 people who work on trust and safety. Making sure that things don't go wrong, helping solving problems when things do go wrong. And just to understand the fact that Airbnb is certainly popular, it started out on the fringes, just to understand just how mainstream it is today. these are sort of scaled estimates of the number of guests staying in a Wyndham hotel, an Intercontinental, and a Hilton, and a Marriott on New Year's Eve 2018, so December 31st, 2017. And this is a representation of the number of people who were staying in an Airbnb on the same night. So there were more people staying in an Airbnb on New Year's Eve this year than in Marriott, Starwood, and Hilton combined. And these are the two largest hotel chains in the world. So this has clearly sort of entered the mainstream. And, Airbnb is still on that hockey stick portion of growth, right? I mean, so this will clearly be one of sort of like, the dominant ways in which we get short-term accommodation in the years to come. My final example, before I get into sort of like, what do we take away from all of this, comes from Europe primarily. It's a company called BlaBlaCar. How many of you have heard of BlaBlaCar? Okay, great. 2 people. That's wonderful. They're, I love talking about BlaBlaCar. So I'll tell you what BlaBlaCar's business model is. A lot of people think that I like talking about BlaBlaCar because I like saying BlaBlaCar. It's like, try saying it. It sort of is. It sort of rolls off your tongue in this appealing way. But BlaBlaCar is a platform that allows you to sell seats in your car if you're driving from one city to another. So let's say you're driving from Paris to Lyon, and you're driving. I'll use an Audi as an example. You're driving like your sort of high-end Audi. You can advertise seats in the car, saying like this has leather seats. It's like top. I live in Manhattan, so I don't know what the latest Audi is. I mean,
Sell those in Manhattan too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm one of those people who doesn't own a car, so it's the Audi A24. Let's make up like sort of like the fanciest Audi of them all. And the person might say that it has leather seats. I play soft jazz, like tinted glass, like I drive below the speed limit. I don't smoke. I'm not very talkative, so you can sort of relax. They even have a rating of like, how talkative you are. You rate yourself as blah, 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 or blah, 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 depending on like, how. And so the Audi owner may sort of price his, price per seat at 35 euros. And there might be someone else competing with them in sort of an old hatchback, windows down, smoking out the window, like Master of Puppets, talking all the time, and that might be 10 euros. And so I've spent a lot of time studying BlaBlaCar because it fascinated me that they were actually pulling this off. Because, when I was growing up, my mom would tell me, like, don't get into strangers' cars and say, drive me to another city. And, it was, she also used to say, like, don't sleep in strangers' spare bedrooms. But, like, that sort of ship sailed a long time ago. So anyway, so if you look at sort of the scale of BlaBlaCar, and this is from 2 years ago, and the blue dots are people traveling from one city to another in someone else's car. Okay, so every day BlaBlaCar today carries 3 times as many people as Amtrak. In France, they carry 5 times as many people every 3 months as the Eurostar train network. And so they have created sort of the equivalent of national transportation infrastructure without a single dollar of investment in steel and concrete. It's all through sort of the tapping into the spare capacity that exists in people's vehicles and the creation of this layer of trust. Because, the reason why I was so fascinated by BlaBlaCar is that I felt that if I tried to understand, what is it that is making people comfortable enough to get into a stranger's car and spend several hours on the highway with them, that I would truly understand what is it about digital technology that is sort of changing how we trust each other? Because this is sort of high stakes, right? This is not like getting a package on eBay or, downloading a video or something. This is, potentially life and death. And so if they're doing it at scale, if hundreds of thousands of people are doing this at scale, or if millions of people are sleeping in strangers' spare bedrooms, then clearly we've done something different with trust. And what I've concluded from both sort of surveying their customers in 11 countries around the world, but also understanding, through choice models, what is it that causes people to sort of choose, one provider over another, is that there seems to be a wide range of cues that people are using to facilitate this kind of trust. There are, in some ways, sort of homegrown trust measures. like reviews from other people, learning from the experiences of others. We've all read these things. We've read them on Yelp and on Amazon and on TripAdvisor, and you have this sort of within the platform itself. You learn from other people's experiences. You have digitized people's real-world social capital. Facebook and LinkedIn now sort of provide sort of a feeling that you can sort of take this leap of trust, that you can enter into this collaborative relationship with the other person before you know how they will behave, right? Which is really what trust is all about. There are traditional government institutions like, ID issuing entities whose sort of capability has now been digitized. You can hold up your license in front of a webcam and a service in 30 seconds can authenticate it. So that can be provided. So there's a range of these things and different people go for different things. Some people want like, a photograph and a verified mobile number. Other people want to sort of read the reviews of other people. So there's no one set of things that makes someone trustworthy. There's sort of a broad range. There's sort of a heterogeneity there. And so I think that's part of the story. And it's part of the story that leads to sort of one of my survey findings, and this sort of repeated across all 11 countries, which is that I asked people like on a scale of 1 to 5, like how much would you trust the following people, and like sort of family member, friend, person who has a BlaBlaCar profile, like but who you don't know, neighbor, colleague, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. And so thankfully, like, social media contacts are not trusted at all. Like, 16% of people said that they would trust a random LinkedIn contact or Facebook contact. But what was striking to me was that people have a higher level of trust in a stranger who has a full trust profile than they do in their colleagues and neighbors. And they have a level of trust that is approaching friends and family levels. This is sort of in a non-scientific counting the 4s and 5s kind of thing. Like, I'm not claiming any statistical difference here, but like, the simple magnitude of difference is pretty striking. And, my first reaction was like, maybe these people have self-selected into BlaBlaCar because they have really terrible neighbors and colleagues. This is why, like, they're jumping into strangers' cars and saying, drive me to another city. But, I think a more rational explanation is that we've got these good trust infrastructures, but we've also become more confident in ourselves at making assessments about things that we don't know based on digital information. We've had practice for about a decade, reading the reviews, reading Yelp, TripAdvisor, sort of making assessments, figuring out what works for us, what doesn't, sort of learning tacitly how to process this digital information. So I think as we get more and more sophisticated as individuals at processing these digital cues, our ability to trust people we don't know or trust businesses we don't know based on digital information will grow. And the reason why I think this is important is because, my belief is that when you create a new infrastructure for commercial trust, then you create the opportunity to change how the economic activity is organized. In sort of a simplistic way, we've seen this happen through history, right? You used to trade with your community, your village. Then, government standards on weights and measures and on, against food adulteration came along. And so you could sort of expand the scope of who you traded with. And then along came contracts and courts of law and property rights. And recently, it's been sort of large branded companies. You don't sign a contract when you buy the Starbucks coffee. You just sort of buy it because you believe that, there's the promise of quality because they want your business tomorrow. But now we seem to be in this 5th phase of having these digital community and interface-based trust systems. So it's not surprising to me that we are seeing new ways of organizing economic activity that are emerging across these industries. It's just sort of the next wave of digitally enabled commercial trust. So how much more time do I have? As much as I want? Yeah? Okay. So that's dangerous, there's, I'm one of those people on whom you should always place boundaries, as Shudipto knows, yeah. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about, what are the implications of this for, the boundaries of the firm, markets, and hierarchies? Maybe spend a couple of minutes alluding to some regulatory challenges that it raises, and then end by going through some of the implications for the future of work, which is the topic that I'm perhaps spending more time thinking about than any other. But in examining like a lot of these platforms that fall under the crowd-based capitalism umbrella, it seems to me that what they represent is a reshaping of institutions that have historically done two things. Provide trust, commercial trust, but also hold what management theorists call structural capital, what some of you might call intellectual property or intellectual capital. It's sort of like, the things that go into, like, that combine with, the labor and the capital that are traditionally held by an organization that lead to the production of the goods and services that people value. And my observation from looking at numerous sharing economy platforms is that the platforms do not hold all the structural capital. But there's also no clear pattern of division of the structural capital between the platform and the provider. So in some sense, at least I was used to sort of thinking of the world in terms of like, hierarchies or sort of managerial capitalism, and like, then you had sort of like, market-based invisible hand stuff. And these platforms seem to sit in between. They seem to be interesting new hybrids of markets and hierarchies. And I haven't really seen a lot of research on this. And, there has been interest in sort of the community of people who study digital technology and its changes on organizations on the boundaries of the firm. But this seems to be a completely new class of institution. Because if you look at sort of like, I'll give you an example. I've looked at over 100 of these, and, you look at 5 of them, and I sort of have a set of characteristics that are hierarchy-like, a set of characteristics that are market-like, and there are sort of these new hybrid capabilities. In some ways, these sort of platforms really span the spectrum between what you might traditionally think of as a market and what you might traditionally think of as a hierarchy. I mean, going back to the example of Airbnb, since it's familiar to so many people, Airbnb is certainly a hierarchy in some sense, right? I mean, they employ thousands of people. They have invested like, hundreds of millions of dollars into building a brand. When you go to them for short-term accommodation, you don't just sort of go on Craigslist and rent someone's apartment. You go to Airbnb. They provide like, this feeling of like, they are a provider of short-term accommodation, this sense of security. If your, host cancels on you, Airbnb will sometimes find you another place to stay. But on the other hand, the host is not just sort of a provider of labor and talent, right? The host is running a tiny business through the platform. The host is setting prices. The host is like, managing inventory. They are making merchandising choices. They are competing with other hosts sort of in the neighborhood. They are building brand through the reputation system. And so there is the genuine, they are sort of creating, like learning by doing and getting better at what they do in a way that seems different from the traditional sort of employee acquiring human capital. Because they are translating this sort of capital into greater returns, relative to what they were getting 2 years ago when they hadn't sort of acquired this capital. And so, Airbnb sort of sits somewhere in the middle on that spectrum between hierarchies and marketplaces. And, this is not meant to be a sort of a precise sort of line that tells you exactly where they are. But there are some that are closer to the marketplace, hands-off marketplace. There are some that are closer to the traditional hierarchy. And it's sort of a fascinating world now because I feel like we're witnessing large-scale experimentation where, many of these platforms of the 100 that I've looked at are already out of business. Maybe 7 or 8 are out of business, and I'm sure many others will go out of business as well. But some are sort of revisiting this division of capital between the platform and the provider. So I've been, running experiments at a platform called GetAround that used to it's a peer-to-peer car rental platform. And it started out by, this is a simple decision, choosing price. GetAround used to allow its providers to set price. So the person who owned the car would choose how much the car would cost per hour. And Getaround's competitor, Turo, sets prices. And so Getaround has been trying to sort of take back pricing control from its providers, and it's been a difficult process. And so, in some sense, they started with one particular division, and they're trying to sort of adjust to another. But there's a whole host of sort of managerial issues that come up when you're trying to change, to optimize the design of your platform. And so I tell people I talk to who are more active researchers than me that, it seems really that there is a fascinating sort of gamut of new research questions around this sort of whole-scale shift away from both the institutional form that we got used to in the 20th century, the large company, and the hands-off marketplace that sort of comes from the econ textbooks, to sort of this space in between, and to understand what will the eventual optimal design be, what will the division of capital between the providers and the platforms be, and to what extent does this vary by industry characteristics, because I think the outcome is going to be different for transportation than it is for short-term accommodation. And will the energy sector evolve to a place where millions of people are running tiny businesses, providing energy that is then sort of powering the neighborhood? Or will someone sort of lease their roofs, large company lease their roofs, install the solar panels, and sort of replicate sort of the older sort of large company thing, and they are just sort of gathering sort of an additional sort of rent from leasing out their roof. So a lot of the reason why people hear about the sharing economy is because platforms like Uber and Airbnb often get into regulatory trouble. This really has to do with the fact that, prior digital disruption often occurred in industries where there wasn't a tremendous amount of local regulation. It certainly happened in communications and in broadcasting, but there was these were federally regulated, and we had sort of actions taken early on that sort of paved the way for the business models to emerge. Whereas short-term accommodation or accommodation in general and transportation are among the most heavily locally regulated industries. And so we hear about regulatory battles between Airbnb and New York City, or between Uber and London, in part because of this tension. So a lot of the time that I have spent talking to government agencies has been about sort of what's the right new regulatory model for these new business models. And to sort of help us get to what that might be, something that seems important to understand is that, we're pretty far down the path of delegating regulatory responsibility to digital platforms already. Forget about Uber and Airbnb. Think about Google and Facebook, and we have delegated censorship to them. We have delegated surveillance to them to some extent. There are platforms that back currency now. Your Facebook ID may be as important as your government ID and sort of your access to certain kinds of online businesses. There's increasingly sort of things that you thought were the exclusive province of the government are being done by platforms. And, this can be, as warfare becomes more and more digitally based, I think sort of the power of platforms like Google and Facebook is going to rival the power of governments. And so, once you realize that, in the way that we conduct our lives today, we have already sort of delegated a lot of responsibility to digital platforms, then the idea of sharing regulatory responsibility between a local government and a platform like Uber or a platform like Airbnb doesn't seem too bad. And if anybody's interested, ask me a question about this. There are some really interesting models that sort of are emerging. So I'll spend a minute sort of like, summarizing by talking about some issues that have come up around the future of work, and then I'll throw it open to questions. So one of the things that the platformization of business models does is that it expands the number of work arrangements that are not full-time employment. Okay, so it creates a new bunch of non-employment work arrangements. And so we hear about this a lot in the context of the millions of Uber drivers or DD drivers who are not employees, but who have some sort of contracting arrangement with the platform. But they also have economic dependence on the platform. And so, like, are they employees? Are they contractors? This is sort of not a new question, but it's one that seems to have been brought to the fore by the fact that, it's happening at scale now through digital platforms. But, as I sort of started out by asserting, this is not exclusively a platform-based phenomenon. Non-employment work arrangements are likely to be a majority of work arrangements in the years to come. And in many ways, what this means is that as a society, we have to wrap our heads around the idea that there is going to be a new relationship between individuals and institutions that is very different from the relationship that employees and employers have had. And that, many of the things that we take for granted, especially in the US and Japan, and to some extent in the UK, where many dimensions of the social contract, of the safety net, are funded by the employer. What this means is that we need to come up with new ways of funding things like workplace insurance, like retirement benefits, like health insurance, predictability in how much money you earn every month, stability in how much money you earn every month. That otherwise we run the risk of ending up with a workforce that is increasingly less protected than the workforce of the previous generation. And so a significant amount of sort of the focus of discussion around digital platforms today is what are the new funding models going to be for this new social safety net, especially in countries like the United States, which are very employer dependent on paying for things other than salary. All right, I'll stop there, and there are lots of other things that become sort of more salient societal issues as we imagine a world not without work, but where a lot of the work is done in arrangements that don't involve full-time employment, who decides your career path, what will your community institutions be. But I'll pause there and so that we have some time for questions. But if you're going to go and get more dessert, I highly recommend taking the cream off the top of the lemon thing and putting it on the blueberry cobbler. That sort of is a really good combination, but that may be the most useful thing I've told you tonight. So anyway, I'll stop there, but thank you. Yeah. Yes.
I really appreciated your thoughts on the sharing economy and crowdfunding. Today, as I was thinking about the theme of the conference and linking firm level to the macroeconomy, when I was trying to think about technological innovations that would facilitate that, blockchain came to mind. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. And I feel like it's also relevant in the context of building digital trust in the way you were mentioning.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's... my initial conception of blockchain-based systems was that they were sort of the next generation of crowd-based capitalism, in that, what the examples I've given you so far are, systems where the crowd is the source, they become the supply, and the platform sort of mediates the transaction. But Bitcoin seems to represent a system where the crowd is actually the market maker. The cloud has sort of we've created software that allows a distributed and heterogeneous crowd to actually clear transactions as well. And so one sort of, one aspiration of people who invest a lot of their time into building blockchain-based systems is that, like, these systems could potentially disintermediate even platforms or, like, any entity that was needed in order to facilitate exchange between two people. I'm skeptical of that future because code is, it's hard to imagine sort of like, embedding everything that an institution does into, forget about even decentralized computer code, but even centralized computer code. There's also sort of like, this conception that somehow computer-based contracts are complete, and they're not, right? I mean, institutions emerge in part because, like, our contracts aren't complete. So a lot of the innovation I see in the use of blockchain technology today is because it contains sort of good distributed database technology. And so banks and insurance companies are using it to create private systems that they should have upgraded like 40 years ago that are, like, more efficient than the systems that they have today, but are not actually going to revolutionize intermediation. They might make things faster. I haven't seen sort of a killer app emerge that has sort of, proved that blockchain technology can do more than, sort of be a payment system. There was one application called CryptoKitties, which was sort of like, sort of Tamagotchi, but, on a system called Ethereum, but nothing like, that sort of has rivaled a sort of like, a mainstream application. I think the promise of trust through blockchain comes from a feeling that, if things are immutable and they're transparent and they're distributed and I can sort of go anywhere accompanied by my history, that can facilitate exchange. I think that might be impactful in industries like music, in journalism, industries where the share of the value from exchange that the intermediary is taking is significant. And where, so like, there'll be enough impetus to sort of shift to a decentralized system, but I don't really see it impacting, at least in the short run, things like search or short-term accommodation or transportation. So. Yes, back there.
How would you see the sharing economy or the work with medical services? Medical services, it seems a little bit more than blah car to like find a neurosurgeon.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't expect sort of crowd-based open heart surgery anytime soon. But what I do think will happen is, or at least one of the things that is happening is that doctors in hospitals are slowly signing up a few hours on platforms that bypass their hospital systems and simply connect them to a patient. The patients are connecting to these systems because even though their insurance doesn't cover it, they have high deductibles. And so if you can go on an app and find a good orthopedic surgeon or like, sort of a good dentist or a good, like, sort of something that isn't like emergency medicine and, sort of trauma, that a small but growing number of people are sort of veering towards this. And this is, not, amateurs on the other end. This is sort of connecting trained professionals with the demand. I also think that there's a lot of potential for, taking some of the non-critical things that are done at, large hospitals today and, converting them into a peer-to-peer system. And so if you sort of have a cut on your finger that requires stitches and you live in a densely populated city where there's sort of almost certainly a registered nurse extremely close to where you live, that may sort of bypass, be a substitute for going to an emergency room. I think that there's a lot of potential in elder care. But as a consequence, potentially hospitals will get smaller. What is sort of sitting under the umbrella of a hospital and the demand that hospitals themselves take in will shrink. some of what is done in every hospital may then sort of be centralized. And so this is sort of the change in healthcare that might come. So it's not like, amateurs doing critical surgery, but, sort of taking some of the non-critical stuff and, delivering it through an app. Yes? Medical tourism, yeah. Yes, there was a question back here. Please.
So I guess my question, I guess I wanted to say blah, blah, car outside out loud first. So it turns out that what has changed in our economy such that we've tried to convince people, for example, to commute with each other in the mornings to work, right? But we just can't get them to commute with other people. You give them discounts and special lanes, and people still want the ride in the car alone. But what's changed with technology that now it's changed our perspective on, as long as I'm utilizing my asset and getting money out of it, it's worth it? What do you think has changed so much that people are now willing to share their car and intimate moments like that? I mean, so not on the person that's not on the person that's taking the ride, but rather the person that's willing to give it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it has to do with sort of liquidity in some sense. That I think the best example of this is one of Didi services in China, which is really carpooling, but at scale. I think 3 million people provide carpool rides every day, and these are typically for 1 to 1.5 hours commutes. It's because you don't have to coordinate with 2 other people to leave at the same time. You can just sort of open the app and find someone else who is driving to where you're going at roughly the same time that you are. So you can leave work 10 minutes late, 10 minutes early. So that's one dimension, that there's simply sort of so much more variety and convenience that, the amount of inconvenience that comes from having to coordinate a carpool is sort of dramatically diminished. From BlaBlaCar itself, something else that seems to come up is this need for connection. It seems that there's research about this from, not my area, but other areas, about how, the need for connecting with other people is physiological. It's not just sort of socially constructed. That you feel sort of social pain in the same way neurologically as you feel sort of physical pain when you don't have enough human connection. And, as we interact with other people more and more through digital interfaces, I think there's sort of a yearning among people for connecting with other human beings. But people aren't motivated enough to fill this void by going to a service that is explicitly designed to connect them with other people. I mean, you don't want to go to a dating site for friends to find, there's... And so what services like BlaBlaCar do is they seem to sort of integrate into the sort of getting of fulfilling of an economic need, sort of some form of human connection, and it's a different kind of relationship. You're sitting in a car with this person for a few hours, and then you may never see them again. But you're sort of tied to that. And I can't explain exactly what has changed beyond the fact that we've got enough trust information to actually make this happen at scale. But I think part of what's motivating people, they sort of seem to come for the convenience and the price, but they stay for the connection. And I think it's just sort of a void in sort of being able to connect with other people that has become more and more prevalent, especially in sort of large cities in the United States and Western Europe.
Arun, perhaps I better cut this off and maybe we can continue discussion over some drinks. I have to tell you, there's one guy, this guy, Kirk Filipich, who's been at 13 CARE conferences, and it reminded me that there has been 3 in this room where we had 3 dinner speakers, all 3 of whom stretched the boundaries of the conference. They presented very different ideas, and you've kept that tradition up wonderfully. You've kept us entertained over dinner. You've stretched our interest in the macroeconomy, which is the basis of this conference, and I just want to thank you very, very much.
Oh, well, thank you for
a
having
great
me. Yeah.
honesty.
And I'm easy to find if you guys didn't get to ask me any questions that you do want to ask me. So.